In Renaissance Rome, they said she carried poison in a ring. They said a single drop in a silver goblet was enough to silence an enemy. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI. For centuries, she has been remembered as one of the most dangerous women in European history, a symbol of corruption inside the Vatican, a noblewoman surrounded by scandal, murder, and whispers of incest. But here is what most people never question. Nearly every accusation came from her family's political enemies. There was no trial, no confession, no evidence of poison ever recovered. So who was Lucrezia Borgia really? A calculating poisoner hidden behind papal power? A pawn in her father's ruthless ambition? Or the victim of a Renaissance propaganda campaign so effective that it shaped history itself? Tonight, we reopen the case. To understand Lucrezia Borgia, we must begin not with the rumors but with Rome. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia secured the papacy and became Pope Alexander VI. His election was controversial from the outset. Accusations of bribery, patronage, and political bargaining shadowed his ascent. Yet once crowned, he did what Renaissance rulers did best: he consolidated power. The Vatican, at this time, was not merely a spiritual authority, it was a political state. Armies were raised, alliances were negotiated, enemies were neutralized. The papal court functioned as both religious center and diplomatic battlefield, and at its heart stood the Borgia family. Lucrezia was born in 1480, the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia and Vannozza de Catania. Though technically illegitimate, she was openly acknowledged by her father, an unusual transparency that reflected both confidence and ambition. From an early age, she was positioned not as a hidden embarrassment, but as an asset. She received an education appropriate to her rank: Latin, music, literature, courtly etiquette. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, poised, and politically aware. There is no credible evidence from her youth suggesting cruelty or intrigue. What we see instead is preparation. In Renaissance Italy, daughters of powerful men were not ornamental, they were instruments of diplomacy. At 13, Lucrezia was formally engaged. By 14, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, a member of one of Italy's most influential ruling families. The union was strategic. It strengthened Borgia alliances in northern Italy and reinforced papal influence. But alliances in Renaissance politics were fluid. When the marriage ceased to serve its purpose, it was annulled. Officially, on grounds of non-consummation. Unofficially, because the alliance was no longer advantageous. The annulment humiliated Giovanni Sforza, who retaliated in the only way available to a wounded nobleman: through accusation. It was he who first publicly insinuated incest between Lucrezia and her father, a charge that would cling to her name for centuries. There is no credible contemporary evidence supporting the claim. Yet the allegation endured. It is here that the pattern begins. When political negotiations collapsed, Lucrezia's reputation absorbed the fallout. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, initially appeared more promising, but once again, the shifting currents of Italian power intervened. Alfonso was attacked in Rome and later murdered almost certainly at the order of Lucrezia's brother, Cesare Borgia, whose ambitions had grown increasingly ruthless. Lucrezia's role in these events remains unclear. No reliable record places her as architect or conspirator. What survives instead are letters suggesting distress and fear following her husband's death. Contemporary diplomats described her as withdrawn, even grieving. Yet outside Rome, the narrative was already hardening. The daughter of a controversial pope, the sister of a feared military commander, a woman present at the center of political bloodshed. In an era where power was personal and reputation was weaponized, proximity was enough to imply guilt. It is crucial to remember that Lucrezia did not command armies. She did not hold ecclesiastical office. She did not issue decrees of execution. Her authority, particularly in her early years, was derivative, flowing through father and brother. But she was visible, and visibility, in Renaissance politics, was dangerous. By her early 20s, Lucrezia Borgia had been married twice, publicly humiliated, entangled in factional rivalry, and embedded within one of the most controversial families in Italy. It is, at this point, not at her birth, not at her education, that the poison rumors begin to gather weight. Not through evidence, but through resentment. In the next part, we examine the accusations themselves, the infamous cantarella, the alleged poison ring, and the deaths that transformed Lucrezia Borgia from papal daughter into Renaissance legend. The goblet is where the legend truly begins. By the late 1490s, Rome was no longer whispering about annulments or alliances, it was whispering about poison. The word most often invoked was cantarella, a substance said to be colorless, tasteless, and fatal within hours. Chroniclers described it with certainty. Modern historians treat it with caution. No verified formula survives. No physical evidence confirms its use. Yet the rumor endured. And the rumor had a name: Lucrezia Borgia. It was said she carried poison concealed within a ring, a delicate Renaissance ornament, supposedly capable of dispensing a fatal drop into wine. It was said that those who dined with the Borgias did so at their own risk. It was said that enemies vanished after banquets, their deaths attributed to sudden illness, fever, or divine judgment. But it was said is not proof. To understand why the accusation gained such force, we must look at the climate of the time. Renaissance Italy was a battlefield without fixed borders. City-states shifted loyalties with alarming speed. Diplomacy was fragile. Betrayal was common. Assassination was not unknown. When powerful men died unexpectedly, suspicion followed naturally. And in Rome, suspicion found a convenient focal point. The Borgias were foreign by origin Spanish in an Italian court. They had risen rapidly. They were unapologetic in their consolidation of influence. Rodrigo had rewarded his children openly. Cesare had abandoned the cardinalate for military ambition. They were visible, they were feared, they were resented. In such an atmosphere, poison is an efficient story. It requires no witnesses. It leaves little spectacle. It explains sudden death cleanly. One of the most frequently cited incidents involves a banquet in the Vatican where several guests allegedly fell ill after dining with the family. Accounts vary dramatically. Some suggest accidental poisoning intended for others. Some describe deliberate elimination of rivals. Others make no mention of poison at all. The inconsistency is revealing. Contemporary diplomatic letters, the most reliable surviving sources, often describe political maneuvering in detail. Yet references to poison tend to appear in hostile commentary, satire, or retrospective chronicles written decades later. This does not exonerate, but it complicates. There is no court record in which Lucrezia was formally accused of administering poison. No medical documentation links her directly to a confirmed toxic death. No forensic evidence as we would demand today survives. What does survive is narrative. And narrative, in Renaissance politics, was a weapon. The image of a beautiful, composed woman silently dispensing death across a banquet table is powerful. It satisfies fear. It satisfies moral suspicion. It transforms political rivalry into theatrical evil. It also shifts responsibility. If Cesare ordered assassinations, and he almost certainly did, attributing subtle poison to Lucrezia recast brutality as intrigue. It made violence intimate, personal, feminine, and therefore more scandalous. We must ask a difficult question. If Lucrezia had been a son rather than a daughter, would poison have clung so persistently to her name? Or would her actions, whatever they were, have been recorded simply as strategy? The myth of the poison ring survives because it is elegant. It fits neatly into Renaissance imagination. It requires little proof and offers immense narrative reward. But the historical record remains stubbornly incomplete. Lucrezia certainly moved within circles where death was political currency. She attended banquets where alliances were sealed and broken. She lived in a court where enemies disappeared. Yet proximity is not authorship. As the years progressed, the poison rumor hardened into identity. Foreign ambassadors repeated it cautiously. Playwrights embroidered it freely. Later, historians amplified it. By the time Lucrezia left Rome for Ferrara, the transformation was almost complete. She was no longer merely the Pope's daughter. She was a symbol. In the next part, we confront the deeper question: was she orchestrating events from behind velvet curtains, or was she being maneuvered by forces far more ruthless than rumor alone? If Lucrezia Borgia was a poisoner, she left remarkably little trace. No confession, no indictment, no contemporary medical account naming her as the architect of a calculated death. What survives instead are rumors and something far more concrete: political reality. To understand her position in Rome, we must separate visibility from authority. Lucrezia moved at the center of power, but she did not command it. Her father was Pope. Her brother, Cesare Borgia, became a military strategist whose ambition reshaped central Italy through force. Cities fell, rivals disappeared, armies marched beneath the Borgia banner. Cesare did not operate in whispers, he operated in steel. When enemies died violently, it was rarely subtle. Strangulation, public execution, battlefield elimination. His methods were direct, and they were documented. This matters. If the Borgia family had required quiet assassination, Cesare possessed both motive and means. Lucrezia, by contrast, held no army, no official decree, no structural authority within the Vatican hierarchy. What she held was proximity, and proximity can be misread as control. After the death of her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, almost certainly orchestrated by Cesare, Lucrezia was sent away from Rome for a period. Contemporary correspondence suggests she was distressed, even fearful of her brother's escalating ruthlessness. These are not the reactions of a woman directing murder from behind velvet curtains. They are the reactions of someone navigating a court where loyalty was fragile and power was concentrated elsewhere. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, marked a decisive shift. Ferrara was not Rome. It was more stable, more structured, less volatile than the papal court. And in Ferrara, Lucrezia's documented actions changed tone entirely. She became a patron of the arts. She corresponded with scholars. She administered estates during her husband's absences. She managed finances with competence noted by contemporaries. Diplomatic reports from Ferrara describe her as intelligent, devout, and politically measured, not seductive, not lethal, not scheming. Measured. This is the contradiction at the heart of her legend. If she had been a master poisoner in Rome, why does the pattern collapse in Ferrara? Why do accusations diminish once she is removed from the epicenter of Vatican factionalism? The answer may lie not in her character, but in her environment. Rome in the 1490s was unstable. The papacy was contested. Italian states maneuvered constantly. The Borgias were outsiders, consolidating authority aggressively. In such a climate, narrative becomes a battlefield. It is often easier to accuse a visible woman than confront the brutal efficiency of the men who commanded armies. Poison is intimate. Steel is structural. One feels scandalous. The other feels strategic. Lucrezia's alleged weapon, subtle toxin in a ring, is theatrical. It satisfies Renaissance imagination. it transforms political violence into something almost operatic. But documented violence in Italy at the time was rarely theatrical. It was efficient. When examining the surviving letters, something else emerges. Lucrezia writes frequently of duty, of reputation, of anxiety surrounding her family's name. She expresses concern over public perception and diplomatic tension. There is no language of secret triumph, no coded celebration of eliminated rivals, no correspondence hinting at chemical expertise or hidden mechanisms. This does not prove innocence, but it challenges the simplicity of guilt. By the early 1500s, Cesare Borgia's power collapsed following the death of Pope Alexander VI. Without papal protection, the Borgia political machine fractured rapidly. If Lucrezia had been a central architect of covert murder, one might expect retaliation, exposure, or legal reckoning once the family's shield dissolved. Instead, she remained in Ferrara, respected, integrated into court life, protected by her husband's lineage. A true political poisoner without protection would have been vulnerable. She was not. This does not erase suspicion, it reframes it. Perhaps Lucrezia benefited from proximity to ruthless men. Perhaps she understood more than she admitted. Perhaps she navigated power quietly, strategically, cautiously. But the image of a solitary woman dispensing death with a ring, that image may reveal more about Renaissance fear than Renaissance fact. In the next part, we confront the machinery behind the myth and ask who truly profited from turning Lucrezia Borgia into a symbol of lethal decadence. Legends do not sustain themselves. They are constructed, repeated, refined. By the time Lucrezia Borgia had settled in Ferrara, the foundations of her darker reputation were already in place. But reputations do not become permanent without reinforcement. To understand how her image hardened into myth, we must look beyond Rome and beyond her lifetime. Renaissance Italy was not merely a theater of war, it was a theater of narrative. Diplomatic letters circulated constantly between courts. Ambassadors reported not only on military movements and treaties, but on character, scandal, weakness. Reputation was intelligence. Intelligence was leverage. The Borgias were uniquely vulnerable. They were of Spanish origin in an Italian political landscape already wary of foreign influence. Rodrigo Borgia's election had been contentious. His patronage of his children was open and unapologetic. Cesare's military campaigns destabilized entire regions. They accumulated enemies efficiently. When powerful families sought to undermine Borgia authority, direct confrontation was risky, but narrative offered a safer weapon. If one could not dethrone the Pope immediately, one could corrode his legitimacy. Accusations of corruption were expected. Accusations of brutality were believable. But accusations of moral depravity were devastating. Lucrezia became a focal point for this strategy. The rumor of incest, first voiced publicly by her humiliated former husband, traveled quickly because it struck at both political and spiritual authority. It framed the papal household not merely as ambitious, but as profane. The poison narrative complemented it perfectly. A beautiful woman dispensing invisible death at banquets was a story that traveled easily across borders. It required no verification. It was vivid, portable, repeatable, and crucially, it distracted. While Cesare conducted open campaigns of territorial conquest, the image of Lucrezia as a silent poisoner personalized Borgia violence. It made the threat intimate, seductive, theatrical. Propaganda does not need to be entirely fabricated. It requires only fragments strategically arranged. A rival dies unexpectedly. A banquet precedes the illness. A family already viewed with suspicion stands nearby. The connection need not be proven. It need only be plausible. By the early 16th century, chroniclers writing outside Borgia influence began consolidating these fragments into narrative form. Their works were not court transcripts. They were accounts shaped by political alignment and moral judgment. Over time, repetition solidified suggestion into assumed fact. Later writers removed even further from primary evidence, embroidered freely. The Renaissance appetite for decadence and scandal ensured that the Borgia name endured as shorthand for corruption. Lucrezia's image evolved accordingly. She was no longer a daughter maneuvered through alliances, no longer a duchess managing estates. She became archetype, the dangerous woman, the poisoner concealed behind silk and pearls, the embodiment of Vatican decadence. Once archetype replaces individual, evidence becomes secondary. It is worth observing what disappears during this transformation. Her documented administrative work in Ferrara, her patronage of artists and scholars, her reputation among local citizens as measured and capable. These details lack spectacle. Propaganda thrives on spectacle. There is also the question of gender. Renaissance political violence, when enacted by men, was often recorded as strategy. Ruthlessness could be reframed as strength, conquest as necessity. For women, proximity to violence was rarely interpreted neutrally. If a man orchestrated assassination, he was formidable. If a woman stood near power, she was manipulative. The poison narrative allowed male aggression to remain structural while relocating moral horror into a feminine symbol. This does not mean Lucrezia was innocent of all political awareness. She lived within a ruthless system. She benefited from her family's ascent. She navigated power carefully. But the leap from political participant to mythic poisoner required amplification. And amplification requires motive. Who benefited? Rival Italian states seeking to weaken papal legitimacy. Foreign courts eager to discredit a controversial pontificate. Later, historians drawn to a story too compelling to abandon. Over centuries, repetition gave the legend durability. By the time modern audiences encountered the name Lucrezia Borgia, the narrative was already curated. Poison, incest, decadence. Rarely nuance. Rarely documentation. Rarely doubt. The propaganda machine had done its work. And once a woman becomes a symbol, history rarely returns her to complexity without resistance. In the final part, we confront the unresolved verdict. Was Lucrezia merely reshaped by narrative forces beyond her control, or did she understand the machinery well enough to survive it? By the time Lucrezia Borgia died in 1519, she was 39 years old. Not executed, not exiled, not exposed in scandal. She died in Ferrara following complications after childbirth. Her funeral was conducted with full ducal honors. The city mourned her as a respected duchess. This is not how the life of a notorious poisoner typically ends. There was no last confession, no dramatic revelation, no hidden cache of toxins discovered after her death. Instead, there were letters, administrative records, patronage accounts, correspondence with scholars and clergy, documents that speak of governance, estate management, diplomacy, and faith. And yet the legend survived. Because legends do not depend on evidence. They depend on memorability. The image of Lucrezia Borgia as a beautiful, lethal figure concealed within the Vatican has endured for over 5 centuries. It has appeared in theater, literature, opera, film. Each retelling has sharpened certain features and erased others. The poison ring gleams brighter than the estate ledger. The banquet death overshadows the diplomatic letter. The rumor outlives the record. But history is rarely a choice between innocence and villainy. It is more often a collision between power and perception. Lucrezia was born into a family that pursued authority aggressively. She benefited from that power. She was shielded by it. She was also constrained by it. She navigated alliances arranged for her. She survived a court defined by suspicion. She adapted when Rome fell and Ferrara demanded stability. Was she politically aware? Almost certainly. Did she understand the value of image? Undoubtedly. Did she move within a world where rivals died? Without question. But the leap from participant to orchestrator, from noblewoman to master poisoner, remains unproven. What we can confirm is this. The men around her commanded armies. The men around her ordered executions. The men around her reshaped territories by force. Their reputations are described as ruthless. Hers became theatrical. That distinction deserves scrutiny. It is tempting to reduce complex figures into symbols. The Renaissance, with its silk and shadow, invites dramatic interpretation, and the Borgias, undeniably, were ambitious to the point of notoriety. But the historical Lucrezia appears more measured than monstrous. When stripped of later embellishment, she emerges not as an icon of decadence, but as a woman negotiating survival within one of the most volatile courts in Europe. The absence of definitive proof does not absolve her, nor does it condemn her. It leaves us with something less satisfying but more honest: ambiguity. Perhaps Lucrezia understood the machinery of reputation well enough to let it operate. Perhaps she recognized that being feared could be safer than being underestimated. Or perhaps she became the most convenient symbol for a family already marked for moral ruin. In the end, what remains is not a vial of poison or a confession whispered in candlelight. It is a question. Was Lucrezia Borgia a calculating architect of invisible death? Or was she the product of a narrative so powerful that it eclipsed the woman herself? History has offered spectacle, but the verdict remains unwritten. History remembers Lucrezia Borgia as a poisoner. But history also remembers what is repeated most often, not always what is proven. So here is the question that lingers. If Lucrezia had been a man commanding armies instead of attending banquets, would we still whisper about poison? Or would we call it strategy? Was she a calculating architect of invisible death? Or the most successful victim of Renaissance propaganda? I want your verdict. Guilty or rewritten? Let's debate it below.